Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. You're watching Culturally Determined, and I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade. And my guest today is Danielle Citron. Danielle, could you introduce yourself?
I am a law professor at the University of Maryland and the author of Hate Crimes in Cyberspace, which was published by Harvard Press in 2014. I write about privacy and free speech and often work with companies on questions about safety and abuse.
Yeah, so our conversation today is going to be about online harassment and other online issues.
Yeah.
What's in the news right now is, at least in the online news, is controversy on Twitter that arose from kind of a byproduct of the Harvey Weinstein scandal.
Yeah.
So the actress Rose McGowan accused Weinstein of rape, I believe, and as one of her Twitter storms about this got her temporarily blocked from the platform. And
Right.
Twitter claimed it was because she tweeted a phone number,
Right.
which
Right.
is, I guess, one of their
Hmm.
rules. But this sparked a lot of protest because she is kind of leading a movement against sexual harassment and rape, and a number of women took a 24-hour boycott from
Yeah.
Twitter to protest this. So what did you think about this?
So I think it's a perfect illustration of how it's hard to scale rules that may be thoughtful. And I know Twitter has worked really hard to make their rules coherent internally and then externally to be clear about what they mean by when they ban threats, harassment, stalking, non-consensual pornography, spam, impersonation, right? They have a pretty long and involved set of, things that they say are not welcome on their platform, right? And it's long been true that personally identifiable information like a social security number, a bank account, and I guess a phone number, it has been banned from the site. They went from being sort of a free speech platform, anything goes except for impersonation and spam, to about 2 years ago when I think it was really bad PR, right? Post Gamergate, the nude photos of Jennifer Lawrence sort of spread all over Twitter, and Twitter just took a step back and said, "We are worried about safety internally. Now we have to be clear about it and take a step against it." So they have made some great strides in the last 2 years. So that brings us to today, right? We've got a political activist and actress with a profound voice coming forward and saying, I've been targeted by this very high profile person who was basically protected by media silence, right? A lot of people knew about his abuse. So what she's doing is speaking out on an issue of incredible public importance. And it seems that and I don't want to speak as it's someone who I work closely with the Twitter safety team. So whatever we're talking about is nothing that's confidential. This is just as an observer and someone who uses Twitter. My sense is from observing the platform that they have a commitment to keeping up, and no matter how ugly, matters of public importance, right? So you would think a tweet by Rose McGowan about the Weinstein attack would be understood as a matter of high public importance, right? Legitimate public importance.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if you know the context and you know the setting and you know who she is.
Well, I was wondering whether it could have just been an algorithm that banned
Right.
her, whether
That's
any
my
human on Twitter's part ever actually interceded in this, because it was such a stupid move.
No, exactly. So that's when I say at scale, there are well thought out rules, and then the question is execution. And I don't know to what extent they're using algorithms to catch things like a phone number or a social security number. But to the extent that they are and it's removed, then it goes through, if it's challenged as it was here, and you get human eyes on it. In context, it's very clear that it should remain up. Maybe not the phone number, right? But her account, of course. Right? So I think that's probably exactly what happened. And the hard thing, and one thing I think these companies have to wrestle with, is I think the more we can teach users, or companies can teach users about why they make the decisions they make, why they have the policies they have, and being as clear and transparent about their decisions, the more we're all likely to buy in. And making a mistake, it seems to me that you came up with a perfectly legitimate explanation for probably why Her account was suspended. Algorithm catches it. It's suspended. It gets reported as an incorrect assessment. There's like a mini appeal, and it's immediately restored.
Mm-hmm.
So be clear. Say it out loud. You teach users about the experience and about your responsiveness, right? The more you communicate with your users, the more you can shape norms in a more accurate way, right? So that is what I imagine happened. Because it's so stupid. It is so not what they have been saying and expressing and doing. They see themselves, by my lights, as a media platform, as an important source of news, right? If nothing else, this was news, right?
Yeah.
This engagement in this debate, as all the women are writing Me Too, right? We are in an important cultural moment where we're paying attention. And thanks to Rose McGowan, I can't imagine in a million years they wouldn't agree with that, right? That is their safety team, and they're very thoughtful safety folks. So it's a mistake. Say it's a mistake. Don't be, right? I mean, that's I think the best of all worlds is showing how it's an imperfect process, but they're attentive to the speech costs of something like taking Rose McGowan down in the middle of an important public debate and putting her back up and saying why they made a mistake. Does that make sense? Like, to me, that's the best response possible.
I agree.
Right.
Do you think that the protest that a lot of women took part in was a little amorphous? What the target was, it was both a protest against sexual abuse, but also against the kind of abuse that a lot of women get on Twitter itself. Do you think that this is going to change anything in terms of how Twitter operates?
Okay, so I think for the most part, their safety team, having worked with them, are individuals who get the problem of sexual harassment on their platform and off their platform. There's a team of incredibly diverse individuals. Many of them are female. They've experienced harassment abuse on the platform themselves. I think as a policy matter, they get it, right? So I feel like we've come a long way in the last 2 years in terms of their actual policies. Of course, at scale, can they get them right all the time? Probably not, right? And how I sort of see the impact. So it's not to say it won't have an impact internally on Twitter. I hope if there's room to do work, that's great, right? But I guess what I think we're seeing is an important cultural moment, both on Twitter, on Facebook. At least I was just looking at my Facebook feed of the number of women. I feel like every single woman I know has been groped, and on my Facebook feed, including myself, right? And many of my friends have been sexually assaulted. I have 2 female daughters. Do you know what I'm saying? Like it's an incredibly common experience, right? From harassment and hey baby, you look hot, street harassment, which is you can ignore and walk away, right? To more sustained abuse, to physical groping that no one wants, and I don't know who gets out of it. It's just a power move, right?
Mm-hmm.
To sexual assault. It's so incredibly common. It's not that we haven't known this, right? But I think given the way in which people are speaking out about it, it is, I think, a helpful cultural moment to learn and talk about it. Is it going to stick and stay? Did it with Anita Hill, right? Anita Hill testifies before the Judiciary Committee about now Justice Clarence Thomas. And within 6 months, there are like 10x times more complaints to the EEOC for sexual harassment at work. It fundamentally changed how we saw workplace sexual harassment, right? Did it totally change how we behave? No, it's the late 80s, right? But we've come a long way, right, since 1987. And look where we are now. We're in a better spot. The workplaces for women are far safer than they were when my mom was at a law firm, right? And the workplaces my daughters will enter into will be far safer. But it's an important cultural moment to say, frankly, we've all experienced it. So many women have experienced it. It's about power. It's not about lust. There's nothing cute about it. And now on Facebook, all of my male friends, many of whom are speech and privacy scholars, have long been supportive of women, but are saying we're teaching our sons. We're part of a constructive conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a positive thing, all net. Are we going to see like gains we can measure tomorrow? No, but we're going to see gains over the long run, I hope.
Can you talk more about the safety team and your work advising it?
Sure. So I've been working with the Trust and Safety Council for the past, I guess, 2.5 years. And I have been working with Twitter, I have to say, since 2009. I have been consulting and talking with Del Harvey, who is the sort of ultimate head of safety, but Sarah Hoyle, who's now sort of head of public policy and safety for the last 2 years. And so what that work entails is talking to them about how they articulate internally their policies about what they mean by harassment, stalking, harassment, hate speech, being clear internally and externally, right, about how it plays out, going through scenarios, talking about, well, is this hate speech? Is it targeted? Is it the sort of speech that Europe is pressuring us to take down, that if it were just the United States, we should consider, right? So they're facing a lot of pressure, companies like Twitter and Facebook, from the European Union, right, the European Commission, to take down far more speech than we would ever take down in the United States, even as just a voluntary matter for companies. So sort of working through being clear about what they mean by terms and ideas that they think, hey, that kind of speech is silencing. It's undermining what we want our platform to be, robust sort of public sphere of conversation. And then figuring out on the ground with examples about what that means. And then meeting and talking about free speech issues, right? Should Richard Spencer, for example, be on Twitter, right?
And he's verified on Twitter. He has the vaunted blue check mark.
And I have to say, and rightly so, right? So my belief is you have to see hate to counter it, to recognize it, and to dispel it, right? If we pretend and hide and act as if there aren't hateful groups and ideas, then we're going to end up shocked over Charlottesville, which we should never have been shocked about, right? I think the idea of hiding and extinguishing speech by people who consider themselves marginalized is going to make them more marginalized, right? By my lights, the only time you take down a hateful group is when they target individuals or they call for specific violence against groups. Mm-hmm. So that would be my advice. They don't have to listen to me. I'm one of many wonderful voices on the Trust and Safety Council, right? But they look to us, academics, activists, free speech activists, right, civil libertarians. We're all together on the Trust and Safety Council to come up with sound ideas.
The international perspective is interesting because I saw just within the past couple of days a little kind of hack that you could do on Twitter, which is if you set your location to Germany, then you get a much more filtered, or not much more, you get a more filtered experience because of laws in Germany about Nazism, where we don't have similar laws. So it is technologically possible to filter some of this stuff, but Twitter is choosing not to do it in the United States. Do you think that makes sense?
I wish they would do a bit more of the geo-blocking. So a lot of the changes that we're seeing companies make, so this is some of my newest work, is on the pressure that companies are facing from the European Commission that's led to a hate speech code of conduct that the four big providers, Twitter, Facebook, Microsoft, and YouTube, signed, that they agree that within 24 hours they will take down hate speech, and they are operationalizing the code of conduct through their terms of service. And terms of service operate globally, right? So speech, if you take down hate speech as a terms of service violation, not as because you have a notice and takedown order from a court in Germany, but if it's through a terms of service violation, it gets taken down globally. So what is a free speech norm in Europe becomes the free speech norm across the globe. Mm-hmm. And that is, so what you're imagining is a one-way ratchet, more protective of speech in the United States, where in fact the opposite is increasingly true, right? That if you operationalize terms of service globally, then if you take down speech because the EU is pressuring you to take it down as hate speech, it's taken down everywhere that the platform is accessed. And so we used to say that free speech platforms, that tech companies use the First Amendment as a guide, and that was true wherever the platform was accessed, unless there was some geo-blocking or requests from courts in Europe that would then block it in France or block speech in Germany. But as we migrate much of these rules and operationalize them through terms of service, it has a global impact, which can adjust to Europe and not the United States.
Right. Can you talk about your piece that you wrote about block buddies?
Mm. So Ben Wittes and I, a year ago, both having faced abuse, but like anybody else on Twitter, right? And having friends who were targeted on Twitter, we wondered, rather than having sort of third-party apps that you would have to install to help create block lists, that if Twitter would allow people to create block lists on Twitter rather than having a third-party application see your data, right, mine your data, have it go through Twitter, right, and have them, use technology on their own site to allow people to share block lists, right, and follow lists, both block and follow. Because if someone's attacking Ben, they're likely, I want to block them too, right? It's a way of thinking about sort of trolls and creating block lists that are easy to share. And then you take away a lot of the abuse, just as we saw, during the run up to the election, the targeting of Jewish writers, right? There was incredible amount of anti-Semitic abuse. Julia Yaffe, Jonathan Weissman, right?
Yeah, I caught a very small amount of
Yes,
that
right?
with my visibly Jewish last name.
No, right. And I was on the ADL task force that was advising and studying the abuse of Jewish journalists. And so all of us were on the task force, like myself and Steve Cole, who's the head of the journalism school at Northwestern, the head of the journalism school at Columbia, and then Julia Yaffe and Bethany Mandel. We all were had our pictures photoshopped into ovens, lovely.
Yeah.
And Citron Jew bitch die sort of thing. And so it was out of that experience that Ben and I began talking about ways that not only companies can be advised about their policies, right, but how can they empower users to help block some of these trolls in ways that the platform can fuel themselves and enable themselves rather than having third-party sort of add-ons. So that's what Ben and I sort of cooked up and talked about in our post for Lawfare. And it wasn't just the idea of jointly blocking, but also jointly following, right? Having, in this, after the election, trying to understand different voices, right? People who disagree with you. There could be follow lists of really interesting, if you're a liberal conservative, voices you want to follow, and vice versa, right? So not just a blocking of speech, but also following that is more speech. And so we at least contended that Twitter should consider using some of this or creating it in-house. They haven't done it yet, but I hope. You never know, right?
Do you think so? I believe that there's a rule on Facebook that you need you can't create like a persona. You need to use your actual identity. Do you think Twitter should embrace a rule like that?
It's a great question. I think the real ID, who it's going to really hurt, that is, in insisting upon real identities, there are always the sort of clever abusers who know how to route around that. But really who gets stuck are probably the domestic violence victim, the political dissenter, like the everyday person who's just not going to speak if they have to identify themselves. Does that make sense? Like I always wonder if it's far more of a self-defeating proposition than it is an effective one. And what's really interesting is the studies about identification and whether you're more willing to be destructive. I mean, there are interesting studies that show that even when you're identified, because you still feel anonymous when you're behind a screen, even if you're identified, that you're just as destructive under a real name, right? It's because you have that feeling, we call it, it's called disinhibition. You have the feeling of being anonymous, and you're disinhibited, so you're destructive, even if your real name is on your Skype or Facebook profile, right? So I'm not entirely sure the trade-offs, it's worth the cost to speech. I don't think you gain the boon in less abuse on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone has ever read like a local news story comment section, especially anything having to do with crime, and it requires Facebook logins to comment, you'll see people saying outrageous stuff under their own name.
And those have been in working on my book, there's a lot of interesting social psychology research on those kinds of comment sections on news, on the New York Times, before they started really like cracking down on abuse, and other local news sites, and how destructive and racist and under people's own names call for violence, especially when it's a crime news story involving a marginalized group. So the actor is African American, the kind of hatred and bile and call for violence is just astounding. So people have studied those comment sections even under their own names, right? They're more than willing to call for violence against individuals under their own names.
Here's something I've kind of wondered for a long time. It must be very, very disturbing to get a violent threat against you made online, a death threat or a threat against your family member. But how often does that cross the line from, like imaginary to an actual physical threat? It seems like it's like a vanishingly small percentage of the time. Does that kind of threat become an actual physical threat?
And so maybe we should talk a little bit about why we say true threats are not protected speech, even if they never cross that, even if it is vanishingly small. I think it's really important to understand why threats are so pernicious, right? And why we say they fall outside the First Amendment's protection is because they send the message, right, that you should be afraid that someone is going to come hurt you, right? And what it does is it changes the person who's the object of the threat. I'm sorry, the subject of the threat. It really changes how they live their lives, right? They internalize the message that they're next, right? It hijacks their autonomy and their choices. They may tell loved ones. It changes how they behave. You get an alarm system. You don't go out late at night, right? It fundamentally, because you don't know, right? If the speaker, who it is, when it's shorn from contextual cues, it actually can be even more frightening than like if we're joking around. You're like, Danielle, I'm gonna, and I know from your face and you're laughing, you're never gonna hurt me, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when I don't know who it is, when I get an email in my inbox that says, my first name and I'm going to do this to you doggy style. Like, I used to get these crazy emails, and because I didn't know who it was, or the sender was like, I hate you.com at yahoo.com or Hitler at yahoo.com. It's pretty terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And because the message is sent, like, you don't know who I am, but I know who you are, bitch, and I'm watching you, it changes how you behave, right? And that's why threats are something that not only we address civilly, and we could with like tort claims like intentional infliction of emotional distress, but also the criminal law, right? The machinery of the criminal law we bring to bear, both state and federal law, against terroristic threats. Because even if the likelihood of you actually being hurt is pretty low, it's the terror. It's the worrying that someone could do that to you that change you. And especially, I think, when you don't have any clue at all as to who it is, it's really terrifying, right? Thinking, what would motivate someone to do that? You know what I mean? So you can imagine, I always think of like the emails and tweets that Brianna Wu showed me that she faced, or Anita Sarkeesian, the kind of, or Zoe Quinn, the torrent.
These are people who are targeted by the Gamergate
folks. And the response often to the Gamergate story was like, come on, get over yourself. It's just trolls being trolls. They're 16-year-olds in their tighty whities in their basement. That was honestly what people would say to me as they interviewed me about the sort of experiences that people were having. And I said, look, if you're these individuals who are targeted and you get tweets that say, I know you live at so and such lane in Andover, Massachusetts, and I'm going to chop your head off, you're terrified, right? So, your question was like, should we really worry about these threats? Because it's only a small likelihood that anyone's going to ever confront you. But they've done all the work that the person speaking wants it to do without you ever having to be confronted in person.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It terrorizes you, right?
Yeah.
So you never have to ever intend to hurt someone physically, as long as you intend to terrorize them.
Let's talk about Facebook for a minute.
Yeah.
You did an interesting interactive piece with the New York Times that we'll link to that is a quiz about hate speech on Facebook and what qualifies as hate speech. And I will say I only got 1 out of the 6 questions correct, so I have a lot to learn.
So did my beloved dean, who I think is one of the smartest people I know, so don't worry. It was the policies that were revealed after the ProPublica story, that Julia Angwin wrote, and the leaked Facebook moderators rules that came out were an attempt to be have rules, right? And have a lot of rules with a lot of detail. And it shows you how hard it is, right? That you got them wrong. So it shows you're being thoughtful and you're really hard about the spirit behind the rules, but then the rules themselves and how we can reconcile them, right? The spirit of hate speech is speech that demeans and humiliates and that shames and terrorizes, right? Because you're a member of a group. And I think what we saw with the quiz was that examples that you would say the spirit of the rules seems like that's hate speech. That seems to target someone because they're a member of a group and sends the message that they're worthless, right? Or that they're going to be hurt. And then as the rules were written, the rules said no, because you're a subgroup. And a lot of that just didn't make sense to me either, right? So it shows you how hard it is to write a set of comprehensive rules that are going to map on, and no matter the context. And context is so key. Does that make sense? Like every time we talked about it, the New York Times writer, Audrey and I went through all the examples. And so often we said, well, what else do we know, right? Mm-hmm. Who's the speaker? Who do we think the audience is? What else is being posted around it? And if it's shorn of any other detail, if that's all we see, well, let's talk about the rules themselves. And if it makes sense to say, targeting a subgroup of women isn't hate speech, for example, right? That makes no sense. Saying you're going to beat someone over a bat because they're, right? There were so many examples that I think because we didn't have enough context, because we need more of an explanation as to why we care about hate speech and why they're prohibiting it. We needed much more of an explanation, I think, to the public.
Right. So just one of the examples in the quiz is...
you probably before you and I don't. I'm just going from memory in my conversations with the New York Times.
Yeah, so one of them is poor black people should still sit at the back of the bus. Is this hate speech on Facebook, yes or no? And I picked yes, and the answer is actually no.
It should be yes. Sorry, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, because the explanation is that social class is not a protected category while race is, and this is more an attack on a social class than a racial group.
Right, and by my lights, it's an attack on a racial group, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, right, I think the more that the user community knows about why hate speech is prohibited, and the more their moderators know and understand, right, or training they get, you got to figure out why you ban hate speech, right? The rules get us only half the way there.
There was a news story just yesterday, the day before, that Facebook is hiring. The headline was in QZ: Facebook is hiring more people to moderate content than Twitter has at its entire company.
You mean they're hiring 3,000 more moderators? Is that this? Yeah.
And I was joking online that this is like the world's worst job.
It is. Right? Did you see Adrian Chen, his work on content moderation in the Philippines, that Wired story from years ago? Mm-hmm. No? Oh, it's like brutal work. Having to look at child pornography, just Hitler jokes. You know what I'm saying? Like, it would be a brutal job.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you think, so it seems like Facebook has a much greater commitment to policing this kind of stuff than Twitter, which is more of a free-for-all. I mean, like I said before, Facebook, you need to have an actual identity attached to your profile, whereas you don't on Twitter. Do you have any theories about why these two social media networks have this disparate view of speech and harassment online?
I mean, I think it's the way that the companies evolved and their sort of commitments and where they began have a lot to do with where we've ended up, right? So when I first started working on issues involving hate speech, the sort of in around 2008, 2009, the understanding of Twitter of themselves was we don't ban anything, right? We understand ourselves as a speech platform. And you could have conversations with them. I was part of a group coordinated by the Anti-Defamation League, but then with academics, so Jeff Rosen, Leslie Harris, and myself, and the major companies in Silicon Valley, ADL, and others would get together every year and talk about hate speech and best practices. And Twitter always, for so long, said, nope, we'll listen, but we're not going to do anything about it. And we're only going to address, spam and impersonation and copyright violations, obviously, because they have to, right? They're not immune from liability for copyright violations. But at the same meetings, right, you'd have Facebook that their, I think, market model was for, we want to have people who are 13 and older and families, right? Though that's not where it started. Of course, we know it started at the college level, this sort of more exclusive, the Facebook, right? But it grew. Its model was to grow and have, if they were older than 13, you could have communities of young people. And I think it just, their sense of their own corporate social responsibility was, we're comfortable with banning hate speech. They said at the time, we want to ban nudity, all nudity, right, including breastfeeding moms, which they got in some hot water about, right? And so just that the earlier beginnings had different ways of thinking about themselves and their market, right? What they saw as their market, right? Mm-hmm. And over time, the market model, at least for Twitter, which was that totally hands-off, didn't work, right? When, 2.5 years ago, or 3 years ago, when, the nude photos of all the celebrities were appearing on Twitter and non-consensual pornography was ruining people's lives. And you had people on the inside of Twitter who were incredibly sympathetic to advocacy groups like Cyber Civil Rights Initiative going in and saying, this is incredibly destructive to people. And you had internally safe folks working on safety who wanted the higher ups to agree. And then they finally agreed. It was really bad for PR, right? Mm-hmm. And Jack Dorsey made the commitment. And their general counsel put out a blog post, this was 2.5 years ago, that said, we understand that our platform can be used to silence. And often it's used to silence people who are more vulnerable. And we don't think that's okay anymore. And that was a huge step for them, right? And it could be because it was a good PR move in the wake of Gamergate and the fact-checking. But they made a decision that threats were no longer okay, that stalking and non-consensual pornography no longer were permitted. And Facebook had already been there for a long time, right? And so they have evolved differently, but I think we're seeing some pretty serious convergence around the posting of nude photos without people's consent, threats, persistent stalking that often will involve nude imagery, right? And so they're not as far apart as I think, as you might imagine, or that they once were. And especially now with the pressure from the European Union, I think they're going to increasingly be closer in how they respond to things like extremist or terrorist speech as well as hate speech.
Mm-hmm. Twitter is so idiosyncratic. Like the reason it has a 140 character limit has to do with like the SMS text messaging, which was 160 characters back in the day. And it's like Facebook makes more sense than Twitter. I think this is why Facebook is much more popular than Twitter. And like why Donald Trump became popular on Twitter instead of Facebook is also like weird and mysterious and idiosyncratic. So
that's right.
I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's just like, I don't know. It's Twitter just seems more like a weird accident that happened, and the path dependency has led us down this weird way.
That's right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. It's like a matter of like beginning culture, a matter of like who, enjoyed it and used it the most. I think we often see Twitter much more as like a media platform. At least for me, who do I follow on Twitter? It's all my favorite voices in the news, both liberal and conservative, right? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, I follow my friends and privacy scholars and free speech, journalists. But for me, it's really like I follow a lot of interesting journalists. Whereas Facebook, they're a lot of my very dear friends from across the country, privacy and cyber law scholars, and we get to share photos of our kids, right? And political activism, right? You're right. It's a very different culturally. It's just a different tool for all of us. And that's the sort of beauty of life in many respects. It reflects sort of, there are different spaces with different norms and different, you use it for different things, right? Much in the way we think, okay, the diner is like let's say in law school, you have a community of the corner bar where everybody went on Friday night, but maybe during the day we went to a bookstore, right? Mm-hmm. It evolves in really different ways and creates different communities. Mm-hmm. And they're responsible for it too, right? The platform itself is responsible for sending that message as well and reinforcing how users see the community.
Yeah. Maybe our last topic we'll hit is revenge porn. Can you define this for people who aren't sure what that term means.
Right. And I think I've always, so my colleague, Marianne Franks, who is a professor at the University of Miami Law School, and I have been working on the issue of the non-consensual posting of individuals' intimate imagery for a long time. And early on, the name revenge porn stuck because you had sites that were devoted to the embarrassment and sort of terrorizing exes. Often ex-girlfriends, but it could be ex-boyfriends, right? So you had sites like myex.com, right? Is anyone, I think, up or down? I forgot, right? The Hunter Moore site. Texan.com, where sites devoted to embarrassing and taking revenge on exes. Now, so it got this nickname, revenge porn. But as Marianne Franks always likes to say, and she's the vice president of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, like it's so much better either called non-consensual pornography or the non-consensual posting of intimate images. That's a mouthful, but it's more accurate because it's not always about revenge, right?
And calling it porn, we have an idea of what porn is, and this usually isn't.
Right. And porn by definition is consensual, right? Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with it. Sure, I may not like the conditions in which it's made. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, but it's legally protected, and God bless, and okay, enjoy yourself. You know what I'm saying, mm-hmm. Right? But there's something so obviously fundamentally different from the non-consensual posting of someone's intimate images. So it's coerced sexual expression that has, it's at great cost to privacy and your sense of security and self and trust in other people. That is incredibly damaging.
So remind me of the specifics. Within the last year or two, one of the main guys who was running one of these websites was shut down and imprisoned, right?
Yep. So since 2014, the California Attorney General, then Kamala Harris, now Senator Harris, but I worked with her for 2 years when she was the California AG, and her office, its criminal division, prosecuted Kevin Bollert, who was responsible for one of the, I think, myex.com, and he was sentenced to 7 years in prison. The sentence was actually much longer, and it was reduced to 7 years. And the theory of liability was extortion. So what he would do is say to posters on his site, users, post your ex-girlfriend's nudes. And then at the same time, he had a feature of his site called the Takedown Hammer, which was for $300. The subjects of the photos could spend $300 to take down a photo. It was an extortion racket, mm-hmm. right? And so A.G. Harris brought a criminal case against him. She succeeded, and she brought 2 other criminal cases. One for a site called Win by State, another similar revenge type of site. And then she got a plea agreement in these 2 other cases. So we have criminal convictions or pleas in 3 cases in California. And at least in the trial of Bollert, women and victims took the stand. And it was heartbreaking and moving. And the judge, who was I want to say 80 years old, was like, I get this. This is despicable behavior. You'd think to educate a judge who didn't himself use network tools, had a very moving, and after the trial was had this very moving, his view of the whole trial was this was incredibly damaging behavior that destroyed people's lives. And it was clear, right, that the trial conveyed that message. Mm-hmm. And also the FTC went after Craig Britton, another revenge pornographer, for engaging in unfair and deceptive practices, for calling on users, same idea, extortion, right, and charging people for the takedown of intimate imagery. And he agreed, he signed a consent decree with the FTC never to engage in that practice ever again. So we saw some big moves, right, in law at state level and federal agency, the Federal Trade Commission. And so, but your next question might be, okay, so there are no more, right?
Well, yeah, I was going to ask, has this problem gotten better?
No, I wish it meant that there are no more revenge porn sites. They're, as far as I can tell, they're not charging money anymore. So they're not an extortion racket, but there's still thousands of sites that show non-consensual images of people's nude photos. So sadly, it hasn't totally dried up. The practice of extortion has. Okay,
so what recourse do people have who photos of them have been posted on sites like this?
Right. So if it's a photo the person took of themselves and then shared it with a loved one or a confidant, and that confidant then betrays their trust and puts it online, the person who took the photo of herself or himself can go to the website and say, I own the copyright in the photo. Please take it down. I'm serving you with a DMCA notice and takedown order. Now, most rational operators say, okay, I'll take it down because they don't want to be sued. But what will often happen because people are being rational, they're not worried about lawsuits. It's so expensive to sue. And so they say to victims, sue me. And they don't. You know what I mean? So you will often talk to victims that they'll go to sites like, of course, Twitter and Facebook take it down. Reddit takes it down right away. Craigslist is really responsive. But when it comes to these sort of outlier sites, they just ignore requests. And victims can't, when they go to law enforcement, if they're turned away, they don't have a lot of pressure points then. So if the site itself says, I'm not afraid of a lawsuit, and they're not immune from liability for intellectual property claims, and law enforcement won't do anything, victims have little else to do, right? Mm-hmm. But they can. What is one gratifying thing that's been true since the summer of 2014 is that Google and Bing will de-index the nude photos in searches of someone's name. And that's so often when you talk to victims, what they want is just that when an employer searches them, they don't see the nude photos in a search of their name, a future date, a loved one, a friend. Yeah. So we've seen some progress, in the last 2.5 years.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a slightly optimistic note. So maybe we should end it there.
And optimistically, yeah, we have seen, since the publication of my book, I used to always say, this is incredibly depressing. But now I have some good stuff to say, right? We've made some real progress in the world, both law enforcement, with companies, victims talking about their stories, feeling supported. So there's some small celebrations to be had.
Okay, well, thank you, Danielle, for coming on. Where can people find more of your work if they want to learn more about you?
So my law school website, my bio page, and I also have a website of my own where all of my publications and op-eds, so law review articles, my book, Hate Crimes in Cyberspace, you can get it on Amazon. It's really cheap on Kindle. and I've written about 25 law review articles and then op-eds in really varied outlets like the New York Times and the Atlantic and Slate Times. So that would be great if people would read and engage with the work. That'd be wonderful. I'm on Twitter, though I do a lot of following and reading rather than tweeting myself.
Perhaps wise. And what is your Twitter handle?
At Danielle Citron. That's it. There you go.
Okay, cool. So thank you again for coming on. Thanks to all of our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.